It was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Maplewood. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the streets were as peaceful as ever. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. It all started when Marcus, a 32-year-old black man and longtime resident of the community, walked out to his mailbox to check his mail. He had done this 1,000 times before, nothing out of the usual. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way his neighbor Karen was staring at him from her porch. Or maybe it was the way she suddenly bolted inside her house, only to reappear moments later with her phone pressed to her ear. Marcus didn't think much of it at first. He was used to the occasional odd look or whispered comment in the neighborhood. But what happened next would leave him stunned, and the entire internet talking. Karen, a woman in her late 40s who had recently moved into the neighborhood, had a reputation for being overly cautious. Some might even say paranoid. She was the type of person who called the cops if a delivery driver lingered too long on her street, or if kids played music a little too loud at the park. But this time, she took it to a whole new level. As Marcus stood by his mailbox, flipping through envelopes and ads, he noticed a police car pulling up to the curb. His heart sank. He knew exactly why they were there. Karen had called 911 claiming there was a suspicious person lurking around the mailboxes. Marcus couldn't believe it. He was just checking his own mail, on his own property, in broad daylight. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly anticipated, was what Marcus was about to discover in that mailbox. Something so shocking, so unexpected that it would change everything. As the officers approached, Marcus held up his hands, trying to explain the situation. But before he could say much, one of the officers noticed something unusual in the stack of mail Marcus was holding. It was a letter, but not just any letter. The return address was from a law firm, and the contents inside were about to reveal a secret that had been buried for years. A secret that involved Karen, her family, and a past she thought she had left behind. Marcus's mind raced as he glanced at the envelope. Should he open it right there? Should he wait? And what would Karen do when she realized what was about to come to light? The tension in the air was palpable. The officers, now curious, urged Marcus to open the letter. But as he slowly tore open the envelope, Karen's face turned pale. She had no idea what was coming next, and neither did Marcus. What could possibly be in that letter? How did it connect to Karen? And why was she so desperate to keep it hidden? The answers to these questions would unravel a story so wild, so unbelievable, that it would leave everyone questioning what they thought they knew about their neighbors, their community, and even themselves. But for now, the letter remained unread, its secrets locked away. The officers stood by, waiting. Marcus hesitated, his fingers trembling. And Karen. She could only watch in silent horror, knowing that her life was about to change forever. What happened next would shock the entire neighborhood, and it all started with a simple trip to the mailbox. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Marcus stood frozen, the letter in his hands feeling heavier than it should. The officers, now visibly intrigued, exchanged glances. One of them, Officer Ramirez, stepped closer. "Sir, do you mind if we take a look at that?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Marcus hesitated. This was his mail, his private property. But the weight of the moment, the tension in the air, made it hard to think straight. Karen, still standing on her porch, looked like she was about to collapse. Her hands gripped the railing, her knuckles white. She was no longer the confident, nosy neighbor who had called the cops. Now she looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, okay," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. He handed the letter to Officer Ramirez, who carefully opened it. The other officer, a younger man named Thompson, leaned in to read over his partner's shoulder. The seconds felt like hours as they scanned the contents of the letter. Marcus watched their faces, trying to gauge their reactions. Officer Ramirez's eyebrows shot up, and Thompson let out a low whistle. "Well, this is unexpected," Ramirez said, glancing at Marcus and then at Karen, who was now pacing nervously on her porch. The letter was from a law firm specializing in estate disputes. It detailed a legal claim involving a property that had been left in a will, a property that, according to the letter, rightfully belonged to Marcus. But here's where things got even more complicated. The property in question wasn't just any piece of land. It was the house Karen was currently living in. The house she had moved into just 6 months ago, claiming it was her dream home. The letter explained that the previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Harold Jenkins, had intended to leave the house to Marcus as part of a long-standing agreement. But somehow the will had been altered, and the house had ended up in Karen's hands instead. Marcus's mind raced. Mr. Jenkins had been a family friend, someone who had known Marcus's grandparents for decades. He had always been kind to Marcus, often stopping by to chat or offer advice. But Marcus had no idea about any agreement involving the house. Why hadn't Mr. Jenkins mentioned it? And how had Karen gotten involved? The questions piled up, each one more confusing than the last. Officer Ramirez handed the letter back to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "This is a civil matter," he said. "You'll need to take it up with a lawyer, but this is definitely something you'll want to look into." Karen, who had been silent up until now, suddenly burst into action. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, storming down her porch steps. "That house is mine. I bought it fair and square. There's no way some old man's will is going to take it away from me." Her voice was shrill, her face flushed with anger, but there was something else in her eyes, something that looked a lot like fear. Marcus didn't know what to say. He was still processing everything. All he knew was that this wasn't just about a house. There was something deeper going on, something that had been hidden for years, and Karen seemed to know more than she was letting on. The officers, sensing the tension escalating, stepped between Marcus and Karen. "Ma'am, we're not here to settle property disputes," Officer Ramirez said firmly. "But I suggest you both seek legal counsel. This is something that needs to be handled in court, not on the street." Karen crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glared at Marcus, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and desperation. Marcus, on the other hand, felt a strange sense of calm. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long. As the officers got back into their car and drove off, Marcus and Karen were left standing in the middle of the street, the weight of the situation hanging heavy between them. The neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, slowly retreated inside, leaving the two of them alone. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Karen, what's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "How did you end up in that house? And why didn't you tell me about this?" Karen hesitated, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "I don't have to explain myself to you," she snapped. "That house is mine, and I'm not giving it up. End of story." But Marcus wasn't about to let it go. He had too many questions, and he wasn't leaving until he got some answers. "Karen, this isn't just about a house," he said. "This is about Mr. Jenkins. He was a good man. And if he wanted me to have that house, there's a reason for it. I need to know what happened, and I think you do too." Karen's face softened for a moment, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same defiant expression she had worn before. "You're wasting your time," she said, turning on her heel and marching back to her house. "If you want to fight me on this, go ahead, but you're not going to win." Marcus watched as Karen slammed her front door shut, leaving him standing alone in the street. He looked down at the letter in his hands, the words on the page blurring as his mind raced. What had Mr. Jenkins been trying to tell him? And why had Karen been so desperate to keep it hidden? The answers were out there, somewhere. But finding them wouldn't be easy. Marcus knew he was about to embark on a journey that would take him deep into the past, uncovering secrets that had been buried for years. And as he walked back to his own house, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The next few days were a whirlwind. Marcus reached out to the law firm mentioned in the letter, setting up a meeting to discuss the details of the case. He also started digging into Mr. Jenkins's past, trying to piece together the story of how the house had ended up in Karen's hands. What he found was a tangled web of lies, deceit, and betrayal. It seemed that Mr. Jenkins had been manipulated into changing his will, and Karen had been at the center of it all. But how and why? The more Marcus learned, the more questions he had, and the more he realized that this wasn't just about a house. It was about justice, for Mr. Jenkins, for himself, and for the truth. Karen, meanwhile, was doing everything in her power to keep the truth from coming out. She hired her own lawyer, a slick, high-powered attorney who specialized in real estate disputes. She also started spreading rumors around the neighborhood, trying to turn people against Marcus. "He's just after my house," she told anyone who would listen. "He's trying to take advantage of an old man's death to get what he wants." But Marcus wasn't deterred. He knew the truth was on his side, and he was determined to see this through to the end, even if it meant going up against Karen and her army of lawyers, even if it meant uncovering secrets that some people would do anything to keep hidden. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in the neighborhood grew. People took sides, some supporting Marcus, others standing by Karen. The once quiet streets of Maplewood were now filled with whispers and speculation. Everyone wanted to know what would happen next. Would Marcus get the house, or would Karen manage to hold on to it? And what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered? The answers were out there, just out of reach. But one thing was certain. This story was far from over, and the next chapter was going to be even more shocking than the last.